Good day. Today is Tuesday, 25th February 2025, and the diplomacy around the Ukraine conflict, the various talks to end the Ukrainian conflict continues on its extraordinary course. Now, we've had a meeting in Washington between Donald Trump and the French president, Emmanuel Macron, which, despite appearances of cordiality, as the British media were admitting today, actually produced nothing. And we've also had, perhaps more interestingly, certain rather dramatic events unfold in the United Nations. Now, I spoke yesterday about how the United States was objecting to a European-Ukrainian draft resolution to be presented to the General Assembly, which contained all the usual boilerplate language that the Western powers engage in ever since the start of the special military operation, references to Russia's war of aggression, that kind of thing. The United States objected to it. It insisted that the Ukrainians and the Europeans withdraw that resolution, and it presented its own draft resolution written in much more neutral language, one which did not attribute responsibility to either side for the war, did not blame or criticize Russia, but spoke about the need to bring the war to a swift end. And yesterday, when I did my program, the report said that the Ukrainians and the Europeans were digging in, and that they were refusing to withdraw their draft resolution, to the increasing anger of the Americans. And then all sorts of very strange things started to happen, because it seems that at some point the joint Ukrainian EU resolution was indeed dropped. The US did indeed propose its draft resolution, and contrary to some early reports that appeared in the British media, that was the resolution that was placed before the General Assembly. However, before there was a vote on that resolution, the European states managed to get the American draft amended in order to insert language which the Russians saw as provocative, and which meant that they became unhappy with the draft that was being put before the General Assembly. In particular, the American draft was amended to make statements about Russia invading Ukraine and about the conflict ending on the basis of a settlement which would respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Anyway, this appears to have created a certain amount of confusion. 95 countries voted for it. However, it's important to mention that this is actually less than half of the countries that are represented in the United Nations. The total number of countries that are now members of the United Nations is 193. So 95 countries supported this resolution. 98 either voted against it, as in the case of China and Russia, or abstained, or refused to participate entirely in the entire United Nations debate that led to this vote. Now, in the hours after the vote was passed, one state that voted for the resolution, which was Serbia, apparently approached the Russians and apologized and said that they hadn't intended to support the resolution at all, that they hadn't understood exactly what the resolution said, and that their vote was a mistake. So that one country has already in effect, dissociated itself from its own vote at the General Assembly. The Russians have accepted the Serb apology. I would say that more likely, this is another example of President Vučić, the Serb leader, who, by the way, despite the protests against him, seems to be securely in control. I get the sense that the protests have begun to lose steam. Anyway, it's another example of President Vučić running with the foxes and the hounds at one and the same time, voting for a resolution the Europeans support, and then pretending to the Russians that it was all some big mistake. I'm sorry if that sounds a bit cynical, but that's my own take on Vučić. Anyway, whatever. Shortly after, however, something else happened, which in effect completely reversed what happened in the General Assembly, and which seems to have shocked the Europeans, and, by the way, and for the record, also shocked the UN Secretariat, which, to say it straightforwardly, is very aligned, has become very aligned with the Western powers since the end of the Cold War, and which has taken overall a very negative stance about the special military operation and Russian policy in the conflict in Ukraine. Anyway, a meeting of the UN Security Council took place. The UN Security Council, its resolutions carry legal weight, whereas UN General Assembly resolutions, unless they're passed under the Uniting for Peace formula, are advisory. So UN Security Council resolutions carry more authority, much more authority. Anyway, the UN Security Council convened, and the Americans, I suspect, to the dismay of the Europeans, presented the resolution, their draft resolution, in the original form, omitting all of the amendments that the Europeans inserted into the resolution in the debate which took place in the General Assembly. And that put the Europeans in an extremely difficult position, because very quickly it became clear that the American draft would carry, and that the Americans were in no mood this time to accept any amendment to their resolution, and that they would have support in the Security Council. China and Russia made clear over the course of the debate the fact that they supported the American resolution. So the European states and the two other countries that are allies of the United States and which have faithfully supported every anti-Russian resolution that the United States, during the period of the Biden administration, proposed to the Security Council. Anyway, all of those states, Britain and France, which have veto power in the Security Council, the remaining European state, which I believe is Albania, and Japan and South Korea, rather than veto the American resolution, decided that they would abstain. And they made some rather, their ambassadors made some rather, desperate comments, I thought, trying to explain why they were unhappy with, not unhappy with the resolution, but why the resolution didn't fully correspond with their own views of the conflict, but the resolution passed by a vote of 10-0. Now, I don't think this is the first time in the UN's history that the United States has voted alongside Russia and China with the European powers unhappy. And of course, there have been other instances, occasions, when the United States has taken a different position from its European allies, its NATO allies, and has made that clear in debates in the United Nations. The British and the French, in particular, must be very well aware, or they ought to be very well aware, that this happened disastrously for themselves in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, an occasion when again the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, essentially were pushing in the same direction against the British and the French, who, without American agreement, had launched a war against Egypt that the United States disagreed with. Anyway, that was one occasion in the past when, as I said, there was a break between the Americans and their European NATO allies. But this is the first time this has happened over the course of the Ukrainian crisis. It is, by the way, the first time that the United Nations Security Council has passed a resolution since the outbreak of the special military operation, at least to my knowledge. So the first actual resolution that the Security Council has passed is this very neutral American resolution, which the Russians were prepared to support and which the Chinese were also prepared to support. And of course, given what has been the case over the last 3 years, given the furious and passionate rhetoric we've had from the Biden administration, from the European states, from the British and the French and the other European states, the fact that the United States has moved to present a resolution on the Ukraine conflict which meets with Russian approval and is backed by Russia and China in a vote in the UN Security Council, and which is opposed by the British, the French, and the other, shall we say, members of the Ukraine Project coalition. Well, that does represent an important break, and one which ought to ring alarm bells in the European capitals. Now, I said that the UN Secretariat seemed completely blindsided by these events. Even as I make this video, they continue to give far more prominence to the passage of the resolution in the General Assembly, the amended resolution in the General Assembly, rather than the far more important resolution, unamended resolution that was passed by the UN Security Council. But I've noticed also that they have a change in their policy. They no longer, in their meetings summaries of UN Security Council meetings, provide the text of the resolution which is passed as an appendix to the actual meetings summary, which is unfortunate in my opinion. Instead, they provide a link to the resolution which is passed, which is resolution 2774 of 2025. Only, at least with my computer, the link doesn't work. You don't get any text at all. Just saying. Maybe other people can. Maybe there's some problem with my computer. Maybe nothing much should be said about this. But anyway, I presume one can find the text of the resolution somewhere on the internet. I haven't had the time to do a deep and thorough search, but I understand it's relatively short, just 3 paragraphs long. And as I said, it calls for an end to the conflict as quickly as possible, without according blame on any party. So there we are. That's what happened in the United Nations. The Europeans, the Ukrainians, did everything they could to prevent this American resolution passing. It went, however, eventually to the UN Security Council. The European bluff was called. They were not prepared to publicly break with the United States by vetoing the resolution, which would have potentially created a crisis between the European states and the Americans, and which would have made it impossible to paper over the divisions, and which quite conceivably might have infuriated Donald Trump. And as a result, the Russians and the Americans have the resolution they want. Now, the former British diplomat Ian Proud has released a video, his own video, about this, and he says that this whole affair demonstrates that it's the European powers that are becoming isolated, exactly as I said in my program yesterday. And I obviously agree. Gradually, as events continue to follow their course, I predict that world opinion, global opinion, which has never been enthusiastic about supporting the European stance on the war, will shift further. And the extent of Europe's own isolation on this issue will become ever more clear. However, this is not so far, I think, fully understood amongst the European countries. And, well, we continue to see the European states still trying to maneuver, to find ways to get the Americans back on side or to chart some other course in order to keep Project Ukraine going. Now, the person who's attracted the most attention is the French President Emmanuel Macron, who duly visited the United States yesterday and had meetings with Donald Trump. Now, I have to say this, Tim Stanley, one of the British journalists who, well, I don't always agree with him, but most of the time I don't agree with him. But over the last couple of days, he has been one of the few people to suggest that trying to find a way to end the war, given the fact that the war is being lost, trying to find a way to end the war, as Donald Trump is suggesting, might not be such a bad idea. Anyway, he responded to a speech by the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, a virtual speech, I should say, broadcast to a gathering in Kiev, in which Starmer said that it's not true that the Russians have all the strong cards in the Ukraine conflict. I wonder where that expression came from. Anyway, never mind. Anyway, he said it's not true that the Russians have all the strong cards. And Tim Stanley said, absolutely correct. The Europeans have a card of their own. The card is the Joker, and the Joker is Emmanuel Macron. And I think that just about summarizes what happened yesterday in the United States, in Washington. Now, this is actually a repeat. What happened was a repeat of what happened back in September when Zelensky met with Donald Trump in Trump Tower. It was, again, the same performance from Donald Trump that he put on with Zelensky, was the same performance that he put with Emmanuel Macron. Enormously exuberant, very jolly, giving the impression that he and Macron got on famously well with each other, just as in the Trump Tower meeting in September, Trump sort of implied that he got on famously well with Zelensky. And at the end of it, as became clear over the course of a press conference, incidentally, which was again delayed, as became clear during the press conference, the Europeans, Macron, came away with nothing. Now, it seems from the various discussions that Macron tried to persuade Donald Trump. Reports of the various discussions, Macron tried to persuade Donald Trump to stop having bilateral dealings with the Russians. Trump said, well, of course, the Europeans are going to be kept fully informed. The Ukrainians are going to be kept fully informed. They can talk to the Russians if they choose. They can talk to the Americans. But it became very clear, if you went through the comments each of the two parties made at the news conference, that the Americans, that Trump actually gave no ground on that whatsoever. The Russians and the Americans will continue their practice of bilateral discussions. That apparently is not up for negotiation. Having said that, the Russians have actually contradicted, or if you prefer, corrected Donald Trump on one specific point. Donald Trump, over the last couple of days, and the media also over the last couple of days, has suggested that a bilateral meeting, a follow-up bilateral meeting between the Americans and the Russians would be taking place today, Tuesday, 25th February 2025, and that this meeting, it's been suggested by several people that this meeting would happen in Riyadh. The Russians, Peskov, has said that there's been no such meeting in Riyadh, or from what I could gather anywhere else, that the Russian Foreign Ministry is not in contact with the Americans in that sort of way. Peskov said that the issue now was that the expert groups, the various expert groups between the Americans and the Russians would be formed. And if I understood Peskov's words correctly, and I've only had a limited extracts of them, I get the sense that there is still, there are indeed contacts underway between the Americans and the Russians, but these contacts are about the makeup and the establishment of the expert groups, and that this is an ongoing process. I'm not sure why Donald Trump threw out the suggestion that there would be a follow-up meeting between the Russians and the Americans today, when it seems that wasn't the case. But then Donald Trump has a habit of saying things which, well, shall we say, they should not be taken literally. For example, he told Macron over the course of the discussions, and he also apparently said, well, he said publicly as well, that Vladimir Putin had told him over the phone that, in fact, he, that is to say Putin, had no objection to the eventual deployment of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. Now, that has not only been not only is contrary to every statement the Russians have been making over the last couple of months, and indeed since the telephone conversation between Putin and Trump took place, but it was again flatly denied by Peskov today. When Peskov was asked about it, he referred back to the various statements setting out Russia's position, which is that the deployment of European peacekeepers in Ukraine is for Russia completely unacceptable. Statements that have been made by Lavrov, by other Russian officials, and which have been previously confirmed by Peskov himself. So, again, Trump airily throws out these things about meetings between the Russians and the Americans, which aren't actually going to happen, and about Russian agreement to deploy peacekeepers, which has not been provided. I get the sense that the Russians take all of this entirely in their stride. Their officials have been speaking, actually, recently about the significant shift that they've noticed in the American position and about the welcome nature of that shift. The reason I think Trump does this is because he wants to keep all the various parties, but perhaps the Europeans and even conceivably the Ukrainians, most of all, constantly off balance. They worry that even as Macron is meeting with Trump, the Russians and the Americans are talking, and they, at the same time, are given this slender hope that maybe the peacekeepers will be deployed to Ukraine after all, and that the Russians will come round and will accept it. Something which, by the way, I consider to be completely inconceivable. And I will discuss that later in this program. Trump also apparently was asked by Macron to provide the backstop, the guarantee to the peacekeepers that Keir Starmer has been talking about. And Trump said, well, yeah, of course, the United States is prepared to provide logistical support, but this will be very small. It'll be very, very limited. It won't amount to very much. And there is no need for it to amount to very much because, well, if there is a ceasefire, the Russians will abide by it. This, of course, apparently flatly contradicted, and this is said in public by Trump, this flatly contradicted what we are told Macron said to Trump over many hours of discussions. Well, over not many hours, but over most of their discussions held in private. Macron alleged that after the ceasefires of 2014, 2015 in the Ukraine conflict, the Russians violated the ceasefires. The Russians, by the way, would strongly dispute that claim. They would say, and I think actually the historical record bears them out, that it was the Ukrainians, not the Russians, who violated the ceasefires. Anyway, Macron apparently told Trump that the Russians couldn't be trusted, that they would be likely to violate the ceasefires, and that is why a peacekeeping force would be needed in Ukraine. And here we have Donald Trump saying, well, not going to be a problem because the Russians are going to abide by the ceasefire, assuming one is agreed. Now, as we will see shortly, the Russians have again flatly rejected the idea of a ceasefire. They have again reiterated the hostilities will only end if there is a complete settlement. And statements by Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, and Steve Witkoff show that the Americans know this perfectly well. So we see how Trump is playing Macron like a fiddle. Sometimes he appears to agree with him, other times he appears to contradict him, sometimes he lends Macron hope that the Americans will agree to what Macron wants, provide backstops and logistical supplies to the European peacekeepers if they're deployed, but then he falls short of actually concretely doing so. And, well, if you don't think that my interpretation is correct, well, here's the headline in the Financial Times. Emmanuel Macron, turning point on Ukraine, lacks Donald Trump commitments. And we go on to read that Emmanuel Macron hailed a turning point in efforts to sway Donald Trump on Ukraine, but failed to secure a commitment from the US president to support any deployment of European troops to deter Russia in any post-war settlement, according to officials. So, as I say, it's the game that Donald Trump has now perfected and has learnt to play and plays to perfection. He appears to agree, then it's clear that he doesn't agree. He weaves this web. He plays, as I said, Macron with considerable skill. And he's going to do the same on Thursday with Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer has tried to improve his position with Donald Trump by announcing an increase in British defence spending. He says that by 2025, British defence spending will have increased to 2.5% of GDP from the current level, which is around 2.3%. So we are told. Ian Proud, again, the British foreign policy official, former British foreign policy official, the former British diplomat, has pointed out that this amount, if this increase, if it is ever put in place, will increase the British military budget by around £6 billion. Now, he also points out that the current British defence budget, in nominal terms, is around half the size of the Russian, except that with their budget, which is only 2 times bigger than the British budget is, the Russians have armed forces that are 10 times bigger, and by the way, immeasurably more powerful. Now that should put this whole proposal to increase defence spending to 2.5% by the British in perspective. It's not going to change anything in the long term or in the short term, and it is certainly not going to help Ukraine now. £6 billion, more or less, in this battle of giants is not going to make any difference when Britain is not a giant by any conceivable measure. The United States is, Russia is, China is, but Britain is not. The same, of course, is true of France, and the same is true of Germany. There's lots of talk in Europe about major increases in defence spending. The man who is likely to become, who will become the next German Chancellor, has spoken about how Germany must prepare for a world without the United States, how NATO could be gone by June. He talks about vast increases in defence spending. There's suggestions that the Europeans could float bonds, euro bonds, something which the Germans have up to now always opposed, but anyway, put that aside, that the Germans and the others might start increasing defence spending in Europe by about 700 billion euros. Now that sounds like a huge amount of money. But as I pointed out in programme after programme, you can increase your defence spend by multiples. But if the industrial capacity is not there, if the manufacturing is not there, then all you're doing is you're throwing money at a problem, and you're simply going to increase the costs, and what you will spend will simply result in higher inflation, first and foremost for military products, and inevitably, ultimately, it will increase inflation generally. And, well, as to the state of German manufacturing in particular, the fact that it is probably in an even worse position than many people perhaps appreciate, even in Germany itself. Well, Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism has done a superb piece, an absolutely superb piece, about the current condition of the German manufacturing economy and the problems that it presently has. So, what will probably happen is that if the Europeans do come up with this vast increase in defence spending, they will have to buy weapons from the Americans. At least in the short term. Except, as I've also discussed in many programs, as Brian Beletic has pointed out in program after program, the Americans have industrial capacity problems of their own. And again, not only is that the case, but even if the Americans do start to increase production of weapons over time, which they probably will, I get the sense that their manufacturing base is still in better shape than that in Europe. As I've already discussed in many programs, their priority will be to replenish the depleted inventories of their own armed forces. So Starmer's whole thing about increasing defense spending makes absolutely no sense. It is not going to change the situation anytime soon. It's not really going to impress Donald Trump, who's talking about a 5% of GDP that should be devoted by the Europeans to defense spending. It's not going to alter the geopolitical balance of power. It's not going to achieve any of these things. So here again we see Keir Starmer trying to give himself more cards, but his cards are duds. They're not cards that he can effectively play. But he will come to the United States on Thursday, just as Macron has done, and Trump will play him in exactly the same way as he has played Macron. He will pretend to like Donald Trump. In reality, my sense is he probably does. He will pretend to like Keir Starmer. In reality, my sense is that Donald Trump doesn't actually like Keir Starmer, but that's my own view. He will pretend to get on with Keir Starmer and express interest and limited support for Keir Starmer's ideas, but then Keir Starmer is going to go away and he's going to look over the actual words that Donald Trump has spoken, and he will realize that the Americans have promised nothing. It is what is actually happening on a day-to-day basis, what moves are actually being made, which ultimately tells the true story. And the true story is what we've just seen in the UN Security Council, the Americans and the Russians, for the first time throughout the entire period of the special military operation, working together, at least to a certain degree, and piloting through the Security Council a resolution on Ukraine that satisfies both. It's the biggest seal that we have seen so far in terms of cooperation between these two superpowers. And again, it's one that the Europeans, as they wait to see what Macron comes back with, and as they wait to see what Keir Starmer comes back with, are fundamentally in denial about. Now, the Russians have also been talking, and we've had some very interesting comments, exceptionally interesting comments from the Russians. The first come from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. He held a press conference, a joint press conference with the Foreign Minister of Turkey, Hakan Fidan, in Ankara. But he was also asked questions by the Russian media about the progress of the negotiations with the United States and the prospects of a diplomatic settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. And in summary, Lavrov ruled out any ceasefire. He made it absolutely clear that the Russians are not interested in ceasefires. He ruled out any proposal for some kind of an armistice, which would result in a cessation of hostilities pending a peace treaty. And on all of the fundamental issues, he made it completely clear that the Russians are not only looking for a long-term settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, but that they are making no concessions of any sort at all. And he said this. He was asked about Russia's stance, and he says, I can only reaffirm our stance. It has not changed, unlike the position of the character you mentioned. He means Zelensky, but I'll skip that. He changes it more often than his green T-shirts. Well, that's Lavrov making a joke. The position of the European countries is also hardly comprehensible because it is fairly unstable and changes whenever someone gets certain ideas. The position of the United States stands out in this context. It has been stated consistently and does not call for an immediate reconciliation, preserving the line of contact with subsequent thinking about what is to be done. We always emphasized that this option would not suit us. So what Lavrov is saying is that the Russians explained to the Americans, this is at the meeting in Riyadh last week, that they are not interested in a ceasefire. They're only interested in a long-term settlement. And as Lavrov actually correctly says, Witkoff and Waltz and Rubio have acknowledged as much. Anyway, on the subject of a ceasefire, this is what Lavrov said. And to my mind, it drives a stake through the heart of that whole idea. We already tried this option in April 2022 when we reached an agreement in Istanbul based on the principles that the Ukrainians proposed to us. They made a request asking us to stop the advance of our troops as a gesture of goodwill and even pull back, and we did so. He's talking about the withdrawal from Kiev. The sole outcome was that the West, acting through the then British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, forbade Ukraine to sign the document it had initiated, claiming that Ukraine should continue the efforts to further weaken Russia and would receive arms, conduct mobilization and fight until Russia suffered a strategic defeat on the battlefield. This is why we no longer accept options involving the use of some pieces of advice from the other side. So they're not going to go for Minsk 3, as some people think. They're not even going to pause in the way that they did during the discussions in Istanbul, or pull back as they did during the discussions in Istanbul. President Putin has clearly stated that we are ready to talk with Ukraine, Europe, and any representatives who, in a spirit of goodwill, would like to help achieve peace. But we will stop hostilities only when these negotiations produce a solid and sustainable result that suits Russia. And then he talks at very great length about the persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church, the reality that the 4 oblasts are now Russian territory, the persecution, as he puts it, of the Russian citizens in Ukraine. And, well, he shows no willingness to pull back on any of that either. And further on, he goes into a detailed discussion of what happened in Istanbul and the fact that the Western powers basically pulled the rug from underneath the agreement that appeared to have been already reached. Well, again, to repeat, Lavrov has said it clearly. No ceasefire. There can only be a cessation of hostilities once an agreement has been reached that is solid and sustainable. and which suits Russia. Now, Lavrov has spoken, but another even more important Russian has spoken, and that is President Putin. And Putin has spoken in response to, well, through the medium of another carefully arranged interview with Pavel Zarubin. Now, in my opinion, this is one of the most interesting interviews that Putin has given at any point over the course of the entire conflict. And, well, it starts with a discussion about who has more rare metals, rare earths and all that, Ukraine and Russia. And he says that Russia has many, many, many more and can provide the United States, if there's an agreement, with many more of these things than Ukraine could ever possibly do. He even floats the possibility, by the way, of the Americans and the Russians working together to exploit the rare earths and the minerals in the Russian-controlled 4 regions, which is very, very controversial. Then he enters into what I think is one of the most interesting discussions he has held about Zelensky up to now. And these flow from the skirmishes between Zelensky and Trump over the last 10 days, and from the obvious and growing exasperation of the Americans with Zelensky, and the clear indications that the Americans would be delighted to see Zelensky go. I have discussed all of this in many programs now, and I have pointed out that the Americans, over the last 10 days, have come to the same realization that the Russians came to long ago, that Ukraine is far too slippery an individual to be trusted in negotiations, that he has no real desire to achieve peace, and that he will never really, in good faith, agree peace. And in fact, he is an obstacle to what the Americans want, which is an early end to the conflict in Ukraine. So we have this question from Zarubin. He says, we're seeing an avalanche of statements and debates these days with everyone discussing Trump and why he is so adamant that Zelensky must hold elections and that his approval rating is just at 4%. There's been a lot of criticism among the Europeans regarding Trump's statements. Some even believe that the current stance of the US president is actually playing into Russia's hands. Do you believe this is actually the case? So, what Zarubin is asking Putin is it really the case that it is in Russia's interests for Zelensky to go? That Trump is somehow working in Russia's interests by trying to engineer, or possibly trying to engineer, potentially trying to engineer Zelensky's removal. And this is what Putin says in response. I think this is absolutely not the case. I have my own view on that, and it runs counter to what you have just said. In fact, the person who currently stands at the head of the Kiev regime, that's to say Zelensky, is becoming a toxic figure for the Ukrainian armed forces. He issues clumsy, poorly thought out orders guided by a political agenda instead of military imperatives, and it is unclear where they are coming from. Now, this accords with the comments many people have made. I have made them in various programs on this channel. Alex Christoforou has made them in many comments on his channel. Brian Beletic has made them. Scott of Calibrated has also made them. Many people have made them. Zelensky's orders to the Ukrainian military are becoming increasingly irrational. The orders Zelensky is giving to Ukrainian soldiers to defend every millimeter, to attack in places like Kursk region. Ultimately, all that they're doing is playing into the hands of the Russians. And here we see Putin essentially saying the same thing. He goes on to say this. This results in huge losses for the Ukrainian army that cannot be justified, or should I say, to major or catastrophic losses. He is also becoming increasingly toxic for society in general. Today's vote in the Rada on extending his powers proves this point, as far as I can judge. Zelensky had to go back to the Ukrainian parliament to get his powers extended. The parliament initially failed to vote to do that. There had to be a second vote called before they did. And then Putin goes on to say this. Finally, he, and again he means Zelensky, has boxed himself into a corner by signing an order banning peace treaty talks with Russia. He was the one who stopped these talks. What is this all about? What this means is that he evades talks. Why? Because once the talks begin, sooner or later, and probably quite quickly, they will bring about an end to martial law. Once this happens, he will have to hold an election. In that case, there will be no grounds for not holding an election anymore, since martial law currently serves as a pretext for not holding an election. But if you initiate the talks and they quickly bring about an end to martial law, this means that you need to hold an election right away. The current head of the regime has a problem with this. Why? His approval rating, be it 4% or any other number, does not matter all that much. What matters is that his approval ratings, and according to the information at our disposal, this is objective data, is exactly half that of his closest potential political rival. I'm referring to Mr. Zelensky, the former commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, who was sent, or should I say exiled, to London. His approval rating is twice as high as that of the current regime leader. Notice, by the way, that as Putin sometimes does, when he really dislikes someone, he avoids mentioning him by name. Just saying. Once we consider the possibility that other political leaders, including former prime ministers and presidents, and he means Poroshenko here, may support Zelensky's possible candidacy, it becomes clear that the current regime leader will stand absolutely no chance of winning an election. His chances are zero, unless, of course, he blatantly rigs the election in one way or another, which would also be detrimental for him, since everyone would be able to see through these attempts. This is why he has become a destabilizing factor for the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian society, and the Ukrainian state. I am certain that the current president, US President, Mr. Trump, understands this, which explains why he has been pushing the head of the Kiev regime to hold elections. I see it as Trump's goal to restore political stability in Ukraine, consolidate society, and enable the Ukrainian state to survive. Overall, this benefits Ukraine more than Russia, since our conflict is with the current regime, not the country itself. And then he discusses Donald Trump's position, which is that it's basically about trying to save Ukraine. He says that preserving Ukraine's statehood serves the interests of Ukraine's statehood, and could help preserve it. We have no objection to that, even if we do not want this territory to be used as a launch pad for aggression against the Russian Federation, or as a hostile outpost targeting us. At the end of the day, we want it to evolve into a friendly neighbouring state. Well, this is most interesting because what Putin is basically saying is that it actually suits Russian interests for Zelensky to remain in post. He gives irrational orders. He is assisting the Russian objective to destroy the Ukrainian armed forces. He is destabilizing the Ukrainian state. He is giving the Russians more opportunity to advance further and deeper into Ukraine itself. And why, given that, would the Russians want to see Zelensky removed? By contrast, removing Zelensky, replacing him with someone like Zelensky, a more realistic and rational leader, one who would start to make more rational military decisions, has a much greater prospect of preserving the Ukrainian state, including the current regime. And that would not be fully in Russia's national interests. So it's a most interesting discussion. And I have to say, from Putin, if you look at it and you take a distance from what he's saying, it comes very close, though not exactly, to saying that better Zelensky remains in place, at least for the time being, so that we can use him because he facilitates our quest to destroy completely the existing regime in Kiev. The Russians would not want Zelensky to step down and to be replaced by someone like Zelensky. If the choice was getting Zelensky to step down and replacing him with someone like Viktor Medvedchuk, well, that would be a different matter. But getting Zelensky to step down, having elections now, is more likely to preserve the regime, which the Russians would rather see destroyed, than to facilitate Russian objectives. Now, that is interesting, and as I said, it's curious, again, that people outside Russia don't see this. Now, you could argue that this is Putin being mischievous. Most emphatically, the Russians do eventually want to see Zelensky go, but we could see that the Russians are still focused very much on the war. This is the major takeaway from both Lavrov's and Putin's words. They don't just want a change of leader in Kiev. They want a change of regime. And they don't really believe that that can happen through negotiations. They want it to happen. They realize that it has to be done, achieved on the battlefield. Now, where all this is going, how this is all going to shape out, I'm not sure. It's interesting that Putin has decided to express himself clearly in these words, or fairly clearly in this way, in this interview. But the interview again highlights an essential point, which is that for Donald Trump, Ukraine and the conflict there is a problem. It's a problem for the United States. It is a distraction for the United States. It absorbs resources. It prevents the Americans from focusing single-mindedly on China. And Donald Trump, by the way, today has taken further steps to divorce the United States economically from China. He's taken more steps to try to restrict trade in advanced technologies and chips and that kinds of things with China. That remains very much for Donald Trump the priority. It remains the priority for many members of the Trump administration. Donald Trump is also very keen, obviously, as he has said, to rebuild the American economy, to sort out the many, many problems that American society has and which have accumulated over the last 30 years. Those are his priorities, and those are the priorities for the United States. Ukraine is an unhelpful distraction. For the Russians, by contrast, Ukraine is an existential issue. Ukraine, as it is currently constituted or currently led, remains not just a thorn in Russia's side, but a potential danger point for Russia. And simply replacing one Maidan nationalist, Zelensky, with another Maidan nationalist, Zelensky, is not going to solve that problem. Even if Istanbul Plus is agreed, and the Russians get the 4 regions, and Ukraine passes provisions to change its constitution to say that it will be a neutral country again, and does all of those sort of things. The Russians have deeper concerns and more profound priorities about Ukraine, and ultimately these can only be fully satisfied by a change of regime in Kiev. Putin has avoided saying this up to now, but he has, in my opinion, all but said it in this interview. Well, there we are. That's the Russians setting out their position before the discussions with the Americans. The Russians have indicated to the Americans that what their opinions are. The Americans, we're told, have been receptive to what the Russians have said, but we see that the Russians nonetheless take their security interests very seriously. And in my opinion, the comments by Lavrov and Putin, which I suspect were coordinated, show that the Russians, who know that they have won the war, and that the fighting which is continuing can only play out to their long-term advantage, remain intent on taking an uncompromising stance. Just saying. Now, here I'd like to return now to the topic of the German elections. And I'm going to say a few things. Firstly, in my discussion of the German elections yesterday, which I don't take back to any degree, by the way, it still seems to me, in fact, absolutely seems to me, that Merz is cobbling together a government of losers, the SPD and the CDU, CSU, 28.5%, the second worst result in the union's history. The SPD, apparently the worst result, certainly in their post-war history. You have to go back, it seems, well, far into the past for a point where the SPD polled as badly as they did in the election that has just happened. Anyway, these two discredited and failed parties coming together to form a coalition. There is one thing I have to say, and this relates to the BSW, to Tsar Wagenknecht's party, which is that I feel that in my discussion yesterday, I perhaps underplayed some of the concerns about the fact that they just fell short by 13,000 votes of getting representation in the Bundestag. I not fully appreciated the extent that this might revolve around the question of voting by Germans located abroad, and that there have been apparently many problems with organising that voting. And as has been pointed out to me, and as I failed to appreciate yesterday, if Sarah Wagenknecht's party had been able to enter the Bundestag, then it would have changed the parliamentary arithmetic radically, and it would have meant that a coalition made up of the CDU, CSU and SPD, a grand coalition, would not have had enough seats in the Bundestag to obtain a majority. Even now, its majority is quite thin, about 13 seats as I understand. But if Sarah Wagenknecht and the BSW had got into the Bundestag, they wouldn't have had a majority at all. That would have left them with the choice of either entering into a coalition with the Greens, who apparently are very keen to join the ruling coalition, which would have made the government look even more like, the new government look even more like the outgoing government than had been the case, than is the case now. Or to really hold their nose and enter into a coalition with Die Linke, which has softened its position on many things quite a lot from the positions it used to have, which I suspect would nonetheless still have been ideologically difficult and might have created problems, especially for the SPD. So keeping Sarah Wagenknecht's bloc out of the Bundestag was important, and it will have consequences. Now, saying all of this, I want to be very clear. I'm not making any particular claims about the conduct of the election. Apparently, the BSW is going to bring a number of complaints, which will probably go all the way up to the German Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe. If those complaints are successful, there's still a possibility that they might enter the Bundestag after all. I'm not going to preempt what is decided about those complaints, and I am not going to suggest so far that there was any sinister game being played here to exclude Sarah Wagenknecht and her party from the Bundestag. What I will say, however, is that in the world we have been living in the last 3 years, even though I don't want to think that something like that happened, I can no longer assume that it didn't. We've had an election in Romania cancelled for no objective reason, simply because the result of the first round went to the wrong person who looked like he was going to win the election. Something that, to my knowledge, has never happened in Europe before. We had a election in Moldova, a recent election in Moldova, in which votes of Moldovans living in Russia, basically they were denied the vote, whereas votes of Moldovans living in Europe were counted in a way that suggested that they had overwhelmingly voted for the current president, in a way that contradicted the votes of most of the people who live in Moldova. Again, something which I find troubling, to say the least. And I've been hearing rumours of all sorts of things happening in elections in other European countries, and I don't want to discuss those because, I don't want to float theories about elections that I cannot prove. So, though I don't want to believe, and actually don't believe, that there was something wrong with the way in which this German election happened, I'm going to say this. If we get a case going to the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe which suggests otherwise, I will no longer be as shocked or as surprised as I would have once been. But this is, in some respects, a detail, because there's been a much more interesting article, this time again in Naked Capitalism, by one of the most formidable commentators that I know about European affairs, who is Conor Gallagher. I should say that Naked Capitalism is a pretty exceptional website altogether. I think it should be read very carefully by lots of people. In E. Smith and Conor Gallagher and other contributors, they have an exceptional, they do exceptional coverage and analysis of events. But anyway, Conor Gallagher makes some of the same points that Wolfgang Münchau made in the article I discussed yesterday about how the outcome of the election is to produce a government which is utterly ill-equipped to deal with the fundamental problems that Germany faces. And Conor Gallagher does that as well, but he takes it much further. He says Germany holds an election in an alternate reality. And he says, but Germany held an election, it went about as expected. The biggest surprise continues to be how the majority of parties all support some flavour of ongoing belligerence towards Russia, a policy that is destroying Germany. And he points out that if you actually analyse the policies that all of the parties are taking, even to some extent the AfD, but certainly the mainstream parties, the CDU, the SPD, the Greens, the Free Democrats that were booted out of the Bundestag, and conclusively, by the way. Anyway, if you analyse their stated positions, Die Linke as well, by the way, not only do none of them address the underlying problems of Germany, but they continue to conduct politics and policies as if they were still living in the world that existed 5 or 10 years ago. And he says Germany's House of Mirrors, there's a section of his article that says that, Germany's political elite, they all live in a transatlantic, remain stuck in the rules-based order, transatlantic fantasy land, championing their democracy and liberal values while demonizing Russia, even as reality is out the gates. It is increasingly difficult to square that paradigm while remaining obsessed with supporting Israel's policies and doing all the heavy acts of suppression that we see. And he talks about, more than anything, it is an economy, German economy, circling the drain, which is a wonderful metaphor, by the way, which I intend to borrow, which is largely the result of the war against Russia, as well as hitching itself to, well, the US with a more combative stance against Beijing. And he then goes through all of the various proposals that seem to command a consensus in Germany. And he points out that they're not just more of the same. They are, in a sense, another giant leap in the wrong direction, further towards the abyss. And he also points out that there is, in fact, an alternative. Germany doesn't need to continue to go this way. They could do other things. They could mend fences with Russia. Putin, in the interview with Pavel Zarubin, again said that if the Europeans want to establish contacts with the Russians, they're absolutely free to. The Germans could establish contacts with the Chinese. They could even develop relations on a more Eurasian basis, which might actually suit Germany better than this exhausted remnant of the transatlantic system that they are holding on to. And any article, by the way, which points out that there are alternatives to the course that Germany is currently following, seems to me to be commendable in itself. But I'm going to say something further, because I've been listening to the first words that Friedrich Merz has spoken as Chancellor. He's spoken about how the alliance with the United States might be ending, how NATO might be gone by June. An absurd hypothesis, by the way. I can't, for the life of me, see how that can happen. And nothing that any American official, including Donald Trump, has said suggests an imminent end to NATO. But anyway, that's what Merz is talking about. He is apparently talking about intensifying support for Ukraine. He's going to press forward now with his plan to provide Ukraine with Taurus missiles. These mostly, apparently, are going to be intended to support the Ukrainians in Kursk region, where the Ukrainians are being comprehensively defeated. The point about that is, of course, that it goes completely against the policies of Donald Trump and of the administration in Washington. It's as if Friedrich Merz and the German political class now see themselves as the keepers of a transatlantic alliance, a globalist neocon project, the flame of which is actually exhausted. They want to continue to be loyal allies of a system that is collapsing all around them, and which there are increasing signs that the United States itself is losing interest in. It is myopia taken to the point of absurdity. The Germans continuing, if you like, on a kind of automatic course, loyally fighting the war that is already lost. They are starting to resemble, as a country, or at least as a political class, one of those Japanese soldiers who was left in the Pacific Islands fighting on the Second World War for decades after Japan had surrendered. It is extraordinary that this is the case. As Conor Gallagher correctly says, Sarah Wagenknecht appears to be the only German political leader who seems to have some understanding of how things are changing. Changing, by the way, not just because Donald Trump was elected president of the United States in November, important though that is, but because Ukraine is being defeated and the Russians are coming close to the point when they're going to win. And that is inevitably going to change the entire geopolitical landscape in Western Eurasia. Well, I've spoken in many programs about the obsessive provincialism of the German political class. You have it now set out in all its glory in the actions and behaviour and statements of the man who will be Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. And the extraordinary thing is that none of this appears to be controversial amongst the political class in Germany at all. As many of you know, I have long-standing connections with Germany. It's a country I know well and have strong connections to and intense affection for. I am deeply sorry about what is happening to Germany, about the disastrous direction it is taking, and the way that it is likely to lead the rest of Europe. But there it is. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish my programme today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this programme, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.